Alrighty, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for the Housing Needs and Actions in Rural Greenbelt Communities webinar. My name is Ryan Carlo. I'm the Soil Health Specialist at the Greenbelt Foundation. And today we have report authors Denise and Wayne and an excellent panel of practitioners to discuss our new report. To begin today's webinar, the Greenbelt Foundation wants to acknowledge that the land we meet on and strive to protect consists of treaty lands and is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat. The Greenbelt is now also home to many other diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. We are grateful to the First Peoples for stewarding these lands, and we strive to ensure that the work we do reflects the continued efforts and rights of the First Peoples of this land. We recognize that Ontario needs more housing in all parts of the province. The foundation was interested in understanding and addressing rural housing priorities, and our new report, Housing Needs and Actions for the Agricultural Sector in Rural Greenbelt Communities, in partnership with Caldwell Consulting, intentionally focuses on housing needs and solutions for agriculture. Farm families, agricultural workers, and agribusiness employees need housing options that are affordable, support succession planning, meet the evolving needs of the on-farm workers, and enable agribusiness employees to live closer to where they work. The recommendations in this report support solutions that both protect prime agricultural land and improve the housing supply. Meeting these goals benefits Ontario's economy and rural communities, as agriculture contributes nearly $50 billion annually to the province's GDP and employs 10% of the workforce. All Ontarians benefit from a safe and secure source of local food, with 60% of food produced and consumed locally. The report highlights effective land use policies, innovative housing solutions, the need to improve consistency and reduce costs of approvals, and identifies supports that enable actions such as municipal capacity, guidance, and other resources, as well as financial tools. The Greenbelt Foundation vision includes a thriving rural economy and robust agricultural sector. This new report will help inform stakeholders about needs and actions possible for housing in rural communities, as well as help build consensus for the 10-year Greenbelt Review. Today, we're excited to have report authors Wayne Caldwell and Denise Van Amersfoort to present the report findings and a panel for discussion later on. They both bring a wealth of experience and expertise to the issues developed over careers in planning and researching rural communities. Wayne has been a longtime collaborator with the Foundation, authoring numerous reports on agricultural policies over the years. Denise has been leading agriculture-centric approaches to housing policy in Huron County, setting a standard for other municipalities to follow. This new report on rural housing is now available on our website, and I'll drop a link in the chat as well. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please type them in the chat, and I'll be making a list to ask Wayne, Denise, and our panel at the end of their presentation. With that, I'll pass it over to Wayne to begin.
Thanks very much, Ryan. Real pleasure to be here today with a chance to share our findings with folks who are in attendance. I want to thank the Greenbelt Foundation as well for initiating this work, sponsoring it if you like, I think for a couple of reasons. First, it brings a rural and agricultural lens to the topic of housing in rural communities. And second, it brings a rural and agricultural lens to housing in rural communities. And I just think that that perspective is really important, because as important as housing is, so too is food, and so too is food production, and how we address that as best as we can in a balanced way that meets the needs of the agricultural community and acknowledges the housing issues that exist both on farms and within rural communities more generally. So with that, we'll launch into the first few slides, and Denise and I will be playing tag team on this as we go through the presentation. And at the outset, just to share with you an agenda, the kinds of things that we hope to accomplish. We will take you through some case studies that we did looking at 3 broader jurisdictions in Ontario in terms of what they've done and how that's worked out. We'll share with you some principles that we've identified through the research. And again, at the outset, I'll acknowledge the research team as well as the collaborators. The recommendations that we have identified to the report as well. We'll share all of that with you, and then we'll have a panel discussion with Eric, Allison, and Duncan, who will introduce more formally in a few moments. And of course, a chance for questions following that. Just to acknowledge the authors, in addition to Denise and myself, Shanley Weston and Regan Zink, who I believe are on the call today, played a fantastic role in helping to pull together all of the material, contributing with the writing and other. We have an advisory committee who contributed to the research, checking in at various times, offering comments, reviewing the materials, and so on. I won't read all of their names. They're within the report and they're there for your review. And also to acknowledge the contributions of Greenbelt staff who played a really essential role in helping us to frame the discussion and pull the materials together as well. I should acknowledge that with the advisory committee, though, it's a representation of folks from municipalities, from ag organizations, from the province as well. And I may have left out others in that, but a broad collection of people with an interest in the topic. Of course, there were a number of objectives and research questions, and the key goal or the key objective was to strengthen the agricultural sector with a focus on meeting housing needs that support a thriving agriculture and agri-food sector in the Greenbelt and surrounding rural areas. The report focuses on the Greenbelt, although I believe the findings are more broadly applicable across Ontario, and hopefully people will find that to be of help in that context as well. But it's this focus on agriculture, focus on housing in agricultural areas, and the focus of the importance of rural communities, towns and villages, and helping to provide that essential service. The research questions, the things that we focused on, what are the current policies related to housing and land use planning? What are the housing needs of farm families, ag workers, and rural community workers at large? And again, that lens of what's needed for that essential resource of agriculture. What are the impacts of the above policies on agricultural operations and the growth of the ag industry? There's numbers included within the report as to how critically important agriculture and food is to the province's economy. Let's make sure that we're respectful of that. What are the tax, servicing, and environmental implications of scattered rural residential development? And finally, and this is where the recommendations play out, what are the policy options or directions that would address agricultural needs for housing? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Denise.
Great. Thanks, Wayne. So the geography for this report, as we say, did focus in on the Greenbelt Plan. So this is a geography stretching from Northumberland County in the east to Niagara in the south, north to Tobermory, including both the Oak Ridges Marine Plan and the Niagara Escarpment Plan. Established in 2005, but most recently reviewed 2015, coming into effect in 2017. What we know is that the Greenbelt Plan is up for review again this year. I'm sure that's something that is on the minds of many, and certainly was on our minds as we thought about what were the goals under which the Greenbelt Plan was initially designed and developed, wanting to make sure that we are protecting farmland and those natural heritage landscapes, restricting urban sprawl, and thinking about the vibrancy, not only of the agricultural economy, of course, but also of the communities that are located within. Largely, the Greenbelt Plan is implemented through different municipal documents, and that's something we had a chance to get into through the literature review. So in terms of the structure of the report, as you read through, what you'll see is we did do a deep dive in the lit review, various case studies, and then we set out principles for actions and the recommendations. When you get to that section, you'll see that they're presented with action, very action-oriented. What would be the steps? And then what are the specific expected outcomes for each of those recommendations, which I think is also really important as we as policymakers are often trying to prioritize which to do first. So we'll get into the literature review. This is a really great opportunity to take a look back over the history of policies in Ontario, really stretching back into the 1970s and looking at what have the farmland protection policies been, how have they interacted with the housing needs generally of the province, and then specifically of farmers and farm workers. We had a chance to look at some of the municipal plans today, taking a look at which ones of these policies have been effective, which ones of the options maybe have been removed over the years, and why. I will say it is interesting when you get into the different municipal documents, and I am a planner in my day-to-day life, we all put our own stamp on things. necessarily or sometimes unnecessarily. And so the same term would almost have a slightly different definition in every official plan and then in every zoning bylaw. And one can start to see how you could be maybe a little bit confused, certainly if you're reading from one to the other. But we also saw some really great policy being done throughout Ontario. And we did give some really I think some thoughtful consideration of where we saw great policy, but didn't necessarily see it reflected in the zoning provision. So it wasn't down to that as of right implementation level. And why is that? And how might we be able to help with the recommendations of this study? In terms of our case studies, so there are 3 areas selected, being Niagara, Durham Region, and Huron County. The reasons behind that, we certainly wanted to look at some geographies that were under the Greenbelt plan, a specialty crop area, an area with a large need and proportion of those agri-food workers and on-farm workers was really important, which led us to Niagara Region. Durham being one of the fastest growing areas of the province, we want to think about that interaction between the pressure for the urban development with the protected countryside. And so we did take a look specifically at Durham and Clarington. And then Huron, not certainly within the Greenbelt, but is home to both Wayne and I. It has a strong tradition of ag-focused policy. And so we thought that there was an opportunity to maybe learn from a geography that's a little step removed what might, what might work well in the Greenbelt geography, what might not. And so that's why we did take a chance to look through all of those sort of those regions, their official plans, and their zoning bylaw approaches.
So with each of the case studies, there's a fairly lengthy discussion outlining what's going on within those municipalities, what are some of the key issues, and so on. And at the end of each of the case studies, there's a series of key takeaways. What is it that we really learned in looking at these various counties and regions? And in the case of Niagara, and it's to maybe begin by acknowledging that 30% of the farms in Niagara have hired employees on the farms. So those farm workers are really quite key in terms of how do we address the housing needs for those farm workers. And that was something, you can't have a conversation in Niagara region about agriculture and housing without talking about the needs of the farm workers, some of whom are temporary and some of whom are permanent, and how was that addressed? So housing and temporary farm workers was really quite key in looking at Niagara. On-farm housing and services, and we found with the housing connected to those employees, there are questions that come up with regard to servicing and services, in particular transportation, people leaving the farm to the towns and villages, leaving the towns and villages to the farms, and that back and forth, and safety issues connected to that were often mentioned, and how do we best deal with that in the context of Niagara. Additional residential units are a topic that you'll hear about, I think, in each of the case studies in one way or the other, and certainly in our principles and recommendations as well. And the additional residential units policy, I suppose, that's permitted within the Greenbelt and permitted within the new provincial planning statement. I think it's fair to say folks said it's not fully yet embraced within Niagara. And I think that reflects a couple of things. One of which is how busy things are in Niagara with all of the different services and regions and the planning policies that are being brought into place, but also some questions around the appropriateness of ARUs or ADUs, as they're sometimes called, and how that might fit out. So that was something that was noted within Niagara. Also, it became, I think this is probably true of everyone who's on the call today, the challenges of dealing with the busyness of planning, all of the new policies that have flowed towards us through the province, the need for revisions and changes. And I think it's fair to say that at times folks in Niagara, and we now have the changes at the regional level as well, but for municipalities to keep up with the needs, the demands, and being able to address the changes and the needs of agriculture as they continue to evolve. I think everyone acknowledged the importance of agriculture, the protection of farmland and farmers, and to make sure that there's a balanced approach as we look at housing to the needs of agriculture as it relates to the broader questions of housing more generally. It was also quite interesting to hear, and I know this is the case elsewhere as well, but the importance of bringing young farmers into the ag industry, making sure that they can afford farmland, which is incredibly expensive, and that they can afford housing, which is equally incredibly expensive. And how you balance those two items together was an important discussion point in Niagara. And of course, as we look at urban settlement areas and complete communities, recognizing that most of the housing will be directed to urban settlement areas, how do we make sure that those urban settlement areas are well positioned to receive people from a servicing perspective, from an employment perspective, and that's a good connection back and forth into the agricultural sector. So those are some of the key takeaways that were obvious from Niagara region, and look forward to questions that might come up related to that later.
Over to Durham region, I had the opportunity to take a look at Durham's policies. And one thing I was quite pleased with, we took a look at some of the policies and where they do permit and have permitted second dwellings on farms outside of the Oak Ridges Moraine and on parcels of a minimum size, it's 50 acres, for a number of years. And you know, when I asked local staff, you know, do you have a sense of how much this has been uptaken? The sense was that it's been modest. It's not a policy that's been abused over the years. It's not necessarily even been something that in the past people necessarily felt they wanted to do or needed to do, but there is a feeling that moving forward with the pressure for housing that we may see more of an uptake on the additional dwelling unit policy in Durham. If that is to be the case, there was a real focus on the need for clustering. So wanting to make sure that where there are going to be additional units, whether they're for farm workers or whether it's, you know, a member of the family, really wanting to make sure that those units stay nice and close to the main dwelling. I know there has been a focus on adapting existing accessory buildings. I think the concern is that some of those accessory buildings are actually at a distance from the main dwelling, and there's a bit of a concern in terms of the pressure that could create for severance. And so just thinking about as we move forward, how might we tweak that policy implementation to make sure that we do continue to ward off pressure for severance? Even though there's been housing options in Durham region, one thing we heard from several farmers that were interviewed was that we still need to clarify some of the requirements and make it easier for people trying to navigate the process. So if the farmer is looking to, you know, add an additional residential unit, if they're looking to do something larger, maybe a multi-unit for their farm workers, how can we really help to create some resources, plain language, make this an easier process? I mean, ideally all the way to zoning reform in which it's as of right and they don't need planning approvals. But beyond that, you know, there's still a building permit, there's still septic, different requirements that we could do better in helping people to navigate. There's an incredible urban pressure, specifically in Durham, but in Clarington is where we had looked, and looking at that pressure for urban development and just the pressure it does put on the urban area or the rural area in terms of people looking at maybe it's a surplus farm dwelling that's been severed off, looking at what those properties are going for from a real estate perspective. Like there's just an incredible demand. Living on a farm and working on a farm is not for everyone. For some people, accommodating members of their family on their farm is not for everyone. And they wanted to have opportunities within urban communities. And so the perspective or the theme we really took away is that good urban planning is good agricultural planning. We need to make sure that there are options, there's land, there's infrastructure in those nearby rural urban communities so that we can accommodate folks there who would desire to live in that type of a complete community environment. Huge praise for the agricultural advisory committees in Durham region. There's just great working relationships there, and that came through from so many different voices. So just a real kudos to Durham region for the work that you've done there. I think that's something that many other municipalities could learn from. A really great agricultural strategy in Durham region. But what was interesting in reading through it, and Wayne alluded to this earlier, it was largely silent on housing. So it talked about the need, for example, the specialized labor that's necessary, but didn't talk about the retention strategies, the recruitment strategies, and how housing plays a big role in that. Finally, I think there's just opportunity as we look at those urban centers nearby. Yes, they present a bit of a threat in terms of that continual push for more land, but there's opportunities there too to provide those complete community environments for folks who do work on farms. And so we think that's something that Durham region is really well positioned to respond to and continue to respond to. And I think I'll leave the last one. We sort of touched on it, just that ongoing omnibus bills and how we all deal with that.
And our third case study was looking at Huron, and Denise mentioned why we looked at Huron, the 50-year plus of aggressive agricultural planning. I think one of the things that continues to impress me is this notion of agriculture first related to farmland protection in Huron, that the policy regime, and it's a function of the local economy as well, really brings that focus to agriculture and making sure that that's front and center in the planning policies. Recognizing that there has been an evolving policy, particularly in the towns and villages, increasing density and more diverse housing, and how important that has been in terms of working with the community to try to address some of the housing needs. Also, the innovative communications that are happening, and I'm intrigued with a series of videos that the county put out oriented towards the general public, to the farm community, to the development community as well, in terms of why these changes need to occur in terms of housing. I think that was a helpful lesson from there. And this notion of housing for agriculture, but not at agriculture's expense. And I think a good example of that is the embracement of ARU policies, additional residential use policies, but very clear criteria in terms of where they could be located, and that they're located in such a way as to minimize the risk of severance or issues of that nature down the road. Also, a real focus on as-of-right zoning, and you'll hear more about that yet today. As-of-right zoning in terms of the ability to make sure that people can do things with minimal new approvals required. And then finally, planning for agriculture by planning for settlement areas, to recognize that if we do a good job in the settlement areas, the towns, the villages, and the hamlets, then we provide housing opportunities for agriculture and farm workers in that context as well. So those are the case studies, and this is just a little picture of an image of a house in shed in terms of an ARU having been built in Huron. So coming out of excuse me, coming out of the policy that we looked at, the case studies, we identified a number of principles, and we'll go through these reasonably quickly so we have time for the recommendations. But these principles are those things which are viewed as being foundations, building blocks, if you like, goals that we need to achieve in terms of addressing policy and policy recommendations. So these first two that I'll identify are protecting agricultural land. And we heard about that through everyone, the importance of this occurring both at the provincial and municipal level. Each of the folks that we interviewed recognized the importance of that. And the second one, the foster sustainable agriculture and balance growth with environmental protection, I simply refer to as the do things right policy, do things right priority, if you like, making sure that we acknowledge the importance of agriculture, that we protect it, that we do so, we have an agricultural sector that's sustainable and long-term, and that when growth does happen where it may be required or permitted, that it does so in a way that balances with the environment.
Next to our fairly self-explanatory, support affordable housing and recognize the role of agri-food workers. It's a critical part of the economy. We need them, they need housing, right? So we need to make sure that we're thinking about ways that are inclusive and strategies that are bringing them to the table. The second one, enhancing rural infrastructure. This could be read a couple different ways, but I think we're really focusing in on those towns and villages. We need to make sure that we have the infrastructure there to support housing for the agri-food economy.
The fifth and sixth principle, the first one, promote collaboration between stakeholders, which I think is simply about do good communications, right? Make sure that people are aware, bring on board the municipalities, the farm community, of course, the farm organizations, other stakeholders, in helping them to, and encouraging them to contribute to the development of policy. And ensure municipal capacity for rural planning. And I mentioned this in the context of Niagara, but I think it's an issue across the province. How do we make sure that folks have adequate resources, that they're adequately informed, and that they're in a position to make informed decisions that lead to better outcomes?
Streamline the planning process. So simplified, more efficient planning processes are needed to reduce barriers to housing and development, particularly for farmers. Incorporate flexibility in the policy. So we are planning for one agri-food system as we look over the GGH and the greater Greenbelt area. I think we do want to be consistent where we can, but there are always going to be those specific pockets, specific issues that do need a bit of flexibility. So we want to think about how we can build that into to the plan and policies.
And the final two principles prioritize long-term rural viability. If we think about what our goals are in rural planning and in agricultural planning, it's to create, I think, healthy, vibrant communities. And that speaks to thinking through what's required from a housing perspective, but also remembering the key component of many rural communities within the Greenbelt and beyond is the importance of agriculture and making sure that that's fundamentally recognized and that we make sure that we contribute to healthy communities in that context. And finally, that we support innovation in agriculture and housing. And this might look like different things in different contexts, but it's to simply say that we don't need to necessarily do things the same in the future as we've done them in the past. And we can think about farm worker housing, we can think about pre-assembled homes and things of that nature, modular homes and so on. And those are all principles that we think are important.
So next, Wayne and I are going to walk through the 13 recommendations, and they're going to be presented under different thematic areas. So we looked at housing and farm worker accommodation. What would we recommend for municipal capacity and planning processes, infrastructure and servicing, land and environmental protection for agricultural sustainability, and economic and community development in rural areas. As you read through the document, you'll see each of the recommendations, again, have those action steps and expected outcomes, which really helps to identify which might be a priority or which might be a good fit for your community.
So at the outset, we have two recommendations, and the first speaks to ARUs. And we had lots of discussion related to ARUs, additional residential units, and how they should be addressed. But the landing place that we got to is that the existing policies for ARUs as it's connected to the Greenbelt tends to be appropriate, and that means that it allows the one unit in addition to the principal residence, and that the provincial planning statement that the criteria, which is 2 units, remain in effect elsewhere. We also noted the importance of agribusinesses and how important it is that we start to think about the employment requirements there. And just to share a little story, speaking to one farmer, a fairly large operation, but 10 farm employees. But in addition to that, a processing facility with 120 employees. And he's concerned about housing. He, in fact, has established housing to address that need. And so we need to think that through in terms of how that relates to farm worker housing and elsewhere as well. Recommendation 2 is that the importance of collaborating with agribusiness, ag advisory committees, that we do so in a way to promote innovative housing solutions for farm workers and agri-food businesses.
So number 3, municipalities develop specific housing strategies for farm workers. So in this case, when you read this recommendation, it's actually about those that would be located in an urban settlement area. So for those farmers who said, you know, it's not the right fit for my operation to have the workers on farm, we'd like to see them in a neighboring urban settlement area. Are we ready for that? Have we thought about innovative models, maybe a cooperative housing model where we could help to connect farmers? Our economic development partners could play a role. Also thinking about, you know, transportation needs. Are there some different ways in which we as planners who are regularly asked to work on housing strategies could shift our focus in a way that also includes agri-food workers in a more meaningful way? Number 4 is establish a municipal on-farm worker housing navigator service, a technical guide, something plain language for farmers, for agribusinesses. I know I've certainly thought this would be a wonderful thing to have in my own practice, even in a situation where something is permitted as of right, like an additional residential unit. It's to think through, okay, but what about the access? What about the septic system? Do I need to share a well? How far does it need to be located from this building? Do I need to worry about minimum distance separation? There are many, many things to think about when we're bringing additional residential units of any type onto a farm property. And I think this would be a great opportunity for a partnership with the farm organizations so that we really bring the farmer voice to this type of a guide.
These next 2 recommendations are connected. The first is developing materials to provide better information to help folks understand how to process ARUs, how to deal with farm worker housing as an example. And the second one is this notion of providing educational programs connected to that. How do we make sure that the training materials are out there and delivered? And these are putting responsibilities into the province with both of these, working in partnerships with farm organizations, municipalities, planners, and so on, working in partnership with those folks to first, as mentioned, provide and develop guidance materials, and secondly, to have those delivered in a way that people can benefit from it.
Number 7. So again, looking at that municipal capacity, Wayne's done a great paper for the Greenbelt on this already. I encourage you to read. Looking at how do we help members of the municipal team that maybe don't have direct experience in agriculture feel confident when they're sitting down to write agricultural policy and provisions. We think a planning modernization fund is really critical to be able to get at zoning reform. And what we're really looking for, I suppose, is zoning reform with an agricultural lens. Secondly, we're looking at how municipalities integrate agricultural housing needs into multiple strategies. So we'd like to see agriculture in those housing strategies. But what if you're working on a cycling strategy? You know, maybe there's a great opportunity to link up a farm that has a lot of agri-food workers living on site. Maybe you're working on a local immigration partnership, and you could think about, you know, what is the experience or what could be the strategies for new Canadians who might find themselves working on a farm, living near farming. So I think there's just many ways I think that we can broaden our lens as municipalities to include agriculture more intentionally.
I'll mention, just as a reminder to folks, that each of these recommendations are dealt with in much more detail within the report. We're going through them quickly now, but to provide you with that background. But the number 9 is municipalities develop a rural infrastructure strategy. And that speaks to what are the, first of all, to do an assessment. What are the needs for infrastructure? And they're realizing they vary between urban centers, urban development centers, and they vary with agriculture as well. In an agricultural context, it may be related to, you know, transit as an example. But it's important that we look at these and we think through what are appropriate levels of services and how should they be best provided, recognizing there's a role in particular for upper tier levels of government in this instance. And then secondly, municipalities plan for sustainable housing development and complete communities in rural and urban centers. And it's this recognition that development is best placed from a servicing perspective, the best placed from a long-term impact and agricultural perspective in the urban centers. And again, we've got settlement areas across the Greenbelt that can accommodate the needs of housing, both for agriculture and for the broader rural community as well. And it's important that we think through these things and make sure that we aim for sustainable and complete communities to help enhance the attractivity of those centers.
Right. Number 11, re-examine surplus dwelling severance policies to protect agricultural land. So this is something that was hotly debated. We do think it's warranted to re-examine the policies. Is it still appropriate? Is it still having the intended outcomes? I've certainly had, you know, a farmer say to me, I severed off that house years ago. I thought it was the right decision at the time. And now, as I sit down with my succession plan, I wish we hadn't. So, you know, it's something to look at. It's not to say it has to change, but I do think it's worth taking a look. CIPs, we're starting to see CIPs, community improvement plans that are more ag focused. Some are agricultural tourism promotion. Some are focusing more on CIPs to help enhance local food production. Could there be a housing component of those CIPs that would just help those producers move towards that ability to have additional workers with, I think, very large community benefits? I think it's very worthwhile. And finally, collaborating on data collection. So this was something, as we even undertook this project and many others, that sometimes we do not have the data readily at hand, readily available to know, are the changes we're making having the intended outcomes? So if we think of ARU implementation, you know, from the date that a certain policy was changed, how much uptake have we seen? Is it having expected or perhaps unexpected consequences that would help to inform a shift in the policy approach? If we don't have the data, we can't do the evaluation. So really important for us to think about, how do we build that into our systems?
Thanks very much, Denise. Having gone through the report quickly as we have, we've provided the report to other folks that I'll introduce momentarily who've had a chance to look at it in a bit more detail, recognizing that folks online probably haven't had a chance to read it in detail as yet. And they'll offer a few comments, and then there'll be some time left for some discussions following that. So I'll introduce Alison DeVos, who's with the Economic Development Agricultural Focused in the region of Durham. Duncan Getz, Farm Policy Analyst with the Ontario Federation of Agriculture. And Eric Hatch, who's the Chief Planner now with Port Colborne, previously at Niagara Region. And we're just going to invite the three of them, perhaps just in the order I've listed them there, if they're okay by that, just to offer a few comments on the report, and then we'll open it up to questions. I should also encourage if folks have questions on what Denise and I have gone over, put them into the chat box, and Ryan's going to monitor those, and then we'll get to those after we've heard from our three panelists. So with that, over to Alison, if you'd like to go first.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Wayne, and appreciate the opportunity to review this amazing report. So I'm Alison DeVos, Agriculture Economic Development Specialist with Durham Region, and I'm also a 7th generation farmer, so I'm really excited to see this project happening. So I'll provide some quick thoughts from an economic development perspective. And the first, from a high level view, is in agriculture economic development, awareness of the ag industry is the base and foundation that's needed in our communities and in our local government for us to effectively support this industry's growth. And when decisions are being made at a municipal level, the agricultural context and impacts need to be understood in order to have successful outcomes for agriculture. And this can sometimes be missing or overlooked. And agriculture is so different in the way it operates, as everyone knows, compared to many other major economic industries in our region and in the province. So a tailored understanding of the industry is very helpful. And this report does just that, which helps to bring awareness to the agricultural housing challenges and the context of agriculture that weaves into this complex conversation and is very critical for supporting agriculture in the long term. And for me, this report also helps to bring the importance of agriculture into this larger housing conversation. And we know it's such a big topic, so bringing in the value of the land and the agribusinesses in our community and their needs to be better supported and understood is very critical. And I think this will have big impacts as well on some of the smaller farms who are experiencing many pressures, and this could help with sustainability in the future. So again, raising this awareness and understanding of agricultural perspectives when it comes to housing is key. And affordable housing is needed to attract all skill levels of farm workers. We see this when we're talking with our agribusiness and farmers in the region. And as mentioned, Durham is growing quite rapidly. And like other regions in the GTA and Ontario, we've seen high housing prices. And this is causing some pressures on the farms and the rural housing options available. Especially since COVID, we've seen a lot of people who are looking to escape the city and moving to our rural areas. So that's putting a lot of pressure on the opportunities for farm employees to live near the farms they work on, or for farms to be able to attract local workers who are interested in working on the farm. The housing is not affordable for general farm laborers in a lot of cases, and that's sometimes the type of employees that some farms are looking to attract. And then on the flip side, some farms just can't justify or afford to pay the wages needed to attract employees who would live in the type of housing that's currently available. So this recent shift in the past couple of years has put some pressure on for sure. So overall, we would like to see a general movement to increased housing density and walkable communities with green space and parks within our urban areas to help address the housing and lifestyle needs of the public. And hopefully in the future, this will help take some of the pressure off of our rural area housing and provide more of a range of housing options at varied price points. In Durham, we see a lot of single detached family dwellings, and that that can cause some pressure when it comes to affordability. So I really love how Wayne and Denise have mentioned in the report that good urban planning supports good agricultural planning, and we couldn't agree more on that point. And then the report also highlights the importance of collaboration between government and our ag communities. And we've seen this firsthand with our agriculture advisory committees, that this collaboration really supports impactful change and smart planning. And we're very lucky to have a really strong agriculture advisory committee at the region level, and then as well as in Clarington, which is one of our local municipalities. And firsthand, I can definitely say that the advice and perspectives they've provided has been really valuable to the work that we've done both in our economic development and planning teams. And it's helped to support the buy-in to the projects and strategies early on. And for municipalities who may have limited capacity, I think an ag advisory committee could really support giving that direct feedback early on in the process and help reduce some of those workloads. And then as my last point, is industry can often outpace government policy. So I appreciate that the recommendations touch on streamlining process and supporting innovation in agricultural housing. It's important to keep these top of mind and get creative for how we in government can help to support agriculture communities in the future. So overall, I'm really happy to see agriculture housing being discussed more. And I'd like to thank everyone who is a part of this and pulled it together to support agriculture for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Allison. On to Duncan.
Great. Yeah. I'd like to start just by saying thanks to our host today for this thoughtful and thorough paper and the webinar today. There's a wealth of information here and absolutely no wasted space. Quick note on who the OFA is. The Ontario Federation of Agriculture is the largest general farm organization in Ontario. We represent more than 38,000 farm family members. And in addition to a variety of benefits and policy services, OFA provides voice to our members in the agri-food industry during consultations on issues related to legislation, regulations, and policy changes. So when I talk to folks about farmland preservation, usually what they're expecting to hear is OFA's position that settlement areas and prime agricultural areas should be fixed designations that cannot be changed barring exceptional circumstances. Farmland protection policies are indeed the main wing that supports OFA's farmland preservation priorities, but housing needs paper that we're talking about today does an excellent job of highlighting the other wing to this position. OFA supports planning tools and concepts like complete communities, gentle density policies, stuff like as of right upzoning and related tools, infrastructure, and especially transit infrastructure, and strategic planning in existing built up areas. These are all necessary tools for farmland preservation. We, not only in the Greenbelt, but throughout the province, need to do better at incentivizing intensification and densification. It's a fact of life that development and growth will happen, but it's a choice where we allow it to occur. Ontario loses an awful lot of farmland every year. According to census data between 1996 and 2021, Ontario has lost has gone from 13.8 million acres of farmland to 11.7 million. That's 2.1 million acres of farmland lost over 29 years. For reference sake, the Greenbelt plan covers 1.97 million acres. I mention these numbers because since 2005, the Greenbelt plan has helped to direct much of the potential farmland loss being incurred in the Golden Horseshoe into built up areas that were pre-existing. Greenbelt plan demonstrates that we can choose where to direct development and that the plan works. It's undeniably true that municipalities have a real opportunity to incentivize the kind of growth that supports a thriving agricultural sector. This paper discusses many, if not all, of the strong tools that support strong rural towns and communities. OFA, echoing this paper, would also like to see better alignment between the PPS and local policies. Discussion of rural housing that supports agriculture is greatly appreciated in this policy context. It can be a challenge to meet the labor demands of our agricultural sector. And historically, when we talk about these matters, we tend to think of tender fruits and other labor-intensive farms. This paper, the rural housing paper, rightly points out that policies are designed to address these historically seasonal needs. This paper rightly points out that other forms of farming, like livestock operations, are increasingly reliant on year-round farm worker housing, and this is a need that we need to address. We also need to see farm worker housing policies streamlined. They're often difficult for folks to understand, and I think there's a lot of good solutions presented here. If Ontario applies the tools suggested in this paper, plain language policies, education, how they're used, guidance documents, infrastructure improvements, and so on, that makes a convincing argument that they will support robust local economies throughout the Greenbelt and throughout the rest of the province where applied, and keep farmland in production. Keeping farms financially successful is a very good way of keeping those farms out of speculative investment portfolios and supporting the long-term agricultural use of those lands. I really could go on, but I'll end by saying that I think that this is a very valuable resource. The paper demonstrates just how diverse the agricultural sector is and how many tools are available to help support our sector. So it's important for planning authorities to keep that ball rolling by consulting publicly on how to apply and adapt these policies for their local use. Planning authorities should be careful to consider the contents of this paper and consult with the residents and local groups, like our local county federations of agriculture, regarding changes in plans, policy, and bylaws. There are a lot of good ideas presented here, and I think that Greenbelt farmers would be very interested to discuss their implementation. So that's the end of my quick blurb, and thanks again to everybody for the opportunity to participate today.
Thank you very much, Duncan. And the fact that I slipped to the next slide was no indication, Eric, to limit your time. I was just checking a note in the corner that said more questions were there. So anyway, over to you, Eric.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Eric Gotch. I'm Chief Planner with the City of Port Colborne, but at the time this paper was in development, I was working with Niagara Region in a planning capacity. So I guess I'll start by saying I had about 13 pages of script I was going to read, but seeing as I'm last and we do want to have some time for questions, I'm going to shorten this right down and just start by thanking Greenbelt Foundation, Wayne and Denise for their work on this report. And really thank you for including Niagara in the case study and looking at some of the considerations that we have down here in our area. I guess, I'll start by saying from a general rural housing side, we're looking at provincial directives across Ontario that are now re-examining rural areas as a place to find opportunities and to support or boost housing supply. And that's something that, in the past, maybe direction from the province through the Greenbelt Plan, Niagara Escarpment Plan, and even Growth Plan was a little bit different on. And as we shift that into agriculture, we've got this housing supply challenge that's sort of in a collision with labor shortage as it relates to agriculture. And specifically, we talk about the seasonal agriculture worker program, farms that have workers coming in 8 to 12 months at a time. And in Niagara, that's not uncommon for that to be 40 workers or 100 plus workers. When I left the region, we were in discussions with a greenhouse operator that was looking at a way to, accommodate growth in his business and was forecasting a need for 250 seasonal agriculture workers. And so when you think about what that looks like in terms of the responsibility under that seasonal agriculture worker program for the farmer to provide housing, the only other thing I think of that looks like that is some sort of pipeline camp where people are brought in and they're working in a rural area on a project isolated from many society or sort of social and municipal services. And it really does create challenges just from a housing perspective, a land use perspective. And as we get into siting these buildings and going through the municipal planning process, just the idea of some of the directives that come out of this report through the recommendations as we look at, preserving the agricultural land base and prioritizing long-term viability of agriculture. So I think, as we look at the shift that's occurred, and there has been some discussion from Allison and Duncan on changes in planning at the provincial level. We've got a loss of upper tier plans that previously provided guidance and direction on rural development. And as we start to move into thinking about the Greenbelt Plan Review and the Niagara Escarpment Plan Review for that matter, the planners on this call, as you're considering, your comments for that review, as you're reflecting on this report, maybe consider if you think that your local official plan has the guidance necessary, has the implementation pieces you need in your community to respond to rural housing and certainly agricultural housing. And I think I'll stop there. We leave some time for discussion, and I'm happy to chat further if there's questions about any of the Niagara case pieces. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Eric. And thanks to the three panelists for such worthwhile and relevant comments. So thank you for that. And I'm going to turn it over to Ryan, who has been monitoring the questions. And I noticed a few went into the chat box, and I see there's some actually in the Q&A box too.
Absolutely.
I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Wayne and Denise, for your presentation, and thank you, panelists, for providing your perspectives. Really important to hear all those notes there. Getting into a bit of a discussion. First question here is with regard to ARUs. Were there any concerns raised related to ARUs further increasing cost of farmland? So these units, especially within a rural area, may not be very small. If they serve an immediate need for the farm, what does that do to the future sale of those farms? So Wayne or Denise, if either one of you want to grab that one.
You want it, Denise?
Either way, Wayne, you can speak from experience on this one maybe, but the folks that I've worked with who have done ARUs, they're not necessarily of the opinion that there's going to be that much value gained by building an ARU. I think they recognize that, firstly, most of them don't have plans to sell the farm, and secondly, the question is, when you're looking at the cost of farmland, how much does an additional residential unit actually impact the cost one way or the other? I think for many of them, what they've struggled with more so is we see an immediate need for this unit, whether it's to accommodate a farm worker, a member of our family. When that person no longer needs the space, what might we do with it? And maybe someday it'll be used to accommodate an aging parent. Maybe there will be another farm worker down the road, but more so they're thinking about what if they don't need this space long term? Or maybe let Wayne speak to this a little bit too.
Yeah, I would just say that the concern that we had with the proposal for severances, that, in my view, going back in time, that didn't go ahead, would have led to an increase in land values. From my personal observation, an ARU doesn't add much to the farm's value. And in fact, in some ways, I don't want to call it a liability, but it has a purpose in time. What that means 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the road is a really interesting question, given the clear criteria that it can't be severed. And so it'll be interesting to say. I don't know that we have the definitive answer to that question, but it's a really good question for us to be thinking about.
Excellent. Thanks. Next question here is the difference in role between ARU versus farm labor housing. For farm succession, and if family members are working on the farm, would farm labor housing be sufficient to support farm succession? In zoning, ARUs typically don't require it be used to support a farm. So just some of your thoughts on that.
It was interesting. I recently spoke to a farmer, and he said, just remember that not every farm is the same as the next farm. They all vary, and the needs are different too. So if we think of the farm that I think Eric referred to needing, was it 250 employees, Eric? That's a very different need than the dairy farm, which might need 2 additional employees, and to recognize that they're going to be addressed in very different kinds of ways. I'm not sure if I answered the question. Denise, feel free to jump in on this one as well.
Yeah, I think maybe what they're getting at in some ways, Wayne, is that, when we're looking at farm labor housing, it's specific to who comes to live in that unit, as opposed to with an ARU, it really could be anyone, right? It could be an elderly parent, as I mentioned, but it could just be really somebody who's interested in living on a rural property. There's no requirements. And so I think there's a bit of a fear maybe our ARU is going to lead to the decentralization of general housing uses into the countryside. I think it's something to think about, certainly but I'm not too worried at one per farm. I think also with the clustering requirements, I can speak from Huron's perspective, they're a maximum of 60 meters from that main dwelling or 200 feet. So they're pretty close. So you have to think long and hard, I think, about, are you going to build a unit and have sort of a perfect stranger live 60 meters from your front door for some rental income? Maybe, but I don't think it's going to be a widespread uptake.
Eric's going to jump in here. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I think the only other piece I wanted to add to that is oftentimes you see the farm labor housing contemplated as a temporary use, and maybe even considered as a temporary use exempted from development charges and so on, with the idea that that housing exists while there's a need for it, and when the need no longer exists for the housing, the use ends. I don't think the same approach is considered with respect to additional residential units.
Good point.
Excellent. Great. Thanks for that discussion. Question here about one issue someone's coming up against is there's an undersized rural residential lot in a prime ag area, and the landowner applies for a lot line adjustment to acquire adjacent productive farmland in order to make their lot large enough to meet the city's minimum size for servicing that 1.5 hectares. The PPS allows a lot line adjustment for minor technical reasons. Thoughts on what's a higher priority, adding another dwelling unit or preservation of that half acre of farmland that would be taken out of production?
That's the conundrum that we all face on almost a daily basis. And I guess the best answer to that is quickly an example from years ago. Had a municipality, there was a stream went through the corner of a farm, about an acre and a half in size, a lovely looking building lot. And the municipality was kind of keen, but they said, go ahead and look at it. So we went ahead and looked at it. In that one municipality, there were 140 identical situations. So I think that lesson transfers over to the property that's being questioned as well. I mean, it's one of those things. Does that adjustment to accommodate that as a building lot, does that represent one property in the entire municipality, or are there 200 similar situations? And I think that, in my view, weighs into that discussion to a degree. And I see Denise nodding in agreement with that. And I think that's, I'm not sure there's a definitive answer, but I think you need to think through what are the implications, what are the ramifications of that one example, and then a policy that accommodates that. How many more does it accommodate in a similar vein?
Great, absolutely. Well, I think we used our time really effectively today. I know there's a few more questions in the chat, hoping I can follow up with the panelists to get those answered to those individual askers. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening today. Thank you very much to Wayne and Denise, and to all of our panelists for their great presentations and their thoughts about this report and answering all of the questions. Thank you to the audience for joining us today. This webinar has been recorded, and a recording will be sent to your email in the coming days. So please feel free to share the recording and our new report with any of your colleagues who may be interested. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today, and thank you so much. Have a great day.